In this video, I'll be putting in the chapters in order to resemble that of a typical device chain that can be found when mastering. So I'll begin with equalization. The purpose of EQing during the mastering stage is not truly the same as when mixing. During your mixdown process, you might have used EQ so that the track sits just right in the mix without masking another track that shares the same frequency range. Or perhaps you used EQ in a creative way for sound design. When mastering, however, EQ is generally used to balance the entire frequency curve. A balanced frequency curve will be easier on the listener and reduce any ear fatigue. Before we begin to look at tonal balancing, I stress that one tool that is a must-have is a good frequency analyzer. This will allow you to visually pinpoint the troubled areas before any equalization is applied, plus allowing you to see the effects of any changes. There are a number of freeware analyzers available, as well as a number of low-cost ones that can give you a bit more detailed information. Few that I will often use is Voxino's Span and Blue Cat Audio's Frequency Analyst Pro. Put your frequency analyzer at the very end of your device chain. Keep your eye on it when making any changes to your EQ. Another tip would be to use an EQ plugin that offers a spectrum analyzer right in the EQ, such as shown here with Isotopes Ozone. This makes it easy for you to quickly see the areas that need tweaking. Okay, so now that we have some sort of analyzer in place, let's do a little EQing. As I mentioned, EQing in the mastering stage is to balance the tonal character of your audio. And what I mean by that is so one certain frequency range does not stand out any more than the others. If you are to take a look at a commercially released CD through an analyzer, you'll see that the curve consists of a fairly straight line with a slight decline in slope. There is not one frequency range that is sticking out like a sore thumb. This is what you are trying to achieve. Now, depending on your choice of analyzer, I suggest that you have the speed or ballistics set to slow or average. The reason behind this is that if the analyzer is working in real time, there will be passages in your audio where some frequencies are higher than others, and this is fine. But when you average out all the frequencies through the length of the audio source, this is when there should be no offending frequency ranges. So whenever possible, try to use a slow setting on your frequency analyzer. Start by playing your song from start to finish. Let the analyzer do its thing. Once the song is complete, you can see the areas, if any, that need correcting. Using your favorite EQ, apply any frequency gains or reductions as needed. A tip before we go any further: if you find that your audio has a large number of required alterations, or if you're applying a large amount of gain or reductions to a particular range, then you might want to go back and fix these areas in your mix. There are a large number of EQ plugins out there, and many that are included with your audio application. Which one is right for you is dependent on how much you want to spend, or even more important, how you want the EQ to sound. There are some EQs that are modeled from classic analog devices, while others will have a cleaner digital sound. This is a personal preference. One thing to point out, however, is the band type. Typically, you'll want to use a parametric EQ, which allows you to alter any offending frequencies, plus control the frequencies around it. Some EQs will only offer 4 bands, some 6 or more. How many bands you need are really dependent on the audio source, but 6 is usually a good number. Now there is one standalone application worth mentioning here, Harball. This application is unique in that it offers an audio analyzer plus EQ in one. However, the difference is that the EQ is not your traditional EQ where you would alter one or more of the available bands to correct any problems. Instead, Harball allows you to redraw the entire analyzed curve to create a filter. This gives you far more accuracy than any EQ plugin. The application is a standalone, so you'll have to open your audio file, EQ it, then save it and continue working in your favorite host. But the results are well worth it. Once you have your frequency curve well balanced, the last thing you'll want to do with your EQ is to apply a low and high shelving filter. The low shelving filter will remove any of the extreme lows that cause your mix to sound muddy. This is also important when it comes time to maximizing the loudness. These very low frequencies will take up a lot of power, which will affect the amount of perceived loudness you can achieve. Also apply a high shelving filter to the higher end frequencies to remove any of the harshness that you may find in your audio. Okay, so by now you should have a perfectly balanced frequency curve to work with. The next step would be to apply some compression as needed, which we'll take a look at in the next chapter. In this chapter, we'll take a look at working with compression to help tighten up the overall volume of your track. In a nutshell, a compressor controls the dynamics of your audio by automatically adjusting the levels. With a traditional compressor, once your audio gets past a certain level, called the threshold, the compressor is then instructed to turn the volume down. How much the volume is reduced is based on the ratio setting. A ratio of 1:1 would result in no gain reduction. However, a ratio of 2:1 would mean that for every 2 dB that the level goes over the threshold, only allow 1 dB out. If that is still confusing, let's give a simple example. If you have set your threshold to the level of -12 dB, and your ratio is 2:1, then you would be applying a reduction of 6 dB. There are also other controls of a compressor, such as your attack and release times, which control how fast the compressor is to react to the changes in the level. In the last couple of years, there has been a growing trend in regards to compression and how much is being used on recent commercial releases. We refer to this as the loudness wars. The trend is calling for every CD to be as loud or louder than the next guy's. However, the unpleasant side effect is that this loss of natural dynamics of the audio itself. This trend has started to be debated from various mastering engineers and audiophiles, and hopefully we'll see a reversal to this trend in the near future. Okay, with all that said, let's take a look at when and how you should apply compression. Now, as with anything I might demonstrate in this video, there are no hard, fast rules, just simple guidelines. In the end, it'll be your ears that judge the final result. Just as with the EQ chapter, there is a must-have tool that should be in your device chain. This time, it's a decent RMS meter. The RMS value is your loudness. This is the level that you'll need to concentrate on. Some good ones I recommend are Inspector by Roger Nicholas Digital or Peak Meter Pro from Blue Cat Audio. Some RMS meters, by default, will have a slow response time to show you the average in loudness. This is good for when you're maximizing the final output, which we'll look at later on. However, when applying compression, I like to use a faster response so I can see the dynamics of the audio. Load up your compressor in your device chain right before your RMS meter. As with the EQ, the compressor plugin you will use will depend on the features and sound quality you are after. If possible, try to use a compressor that offers the basic controls of a threshold, ratio, attack, and release. We'll have a closer look at the various compressors available in Chapter 8. Before making any adjustments to your compressor, take a look at the RMS levels of your audio. Watch for the lower RMS levels and the upper RMS levels. What is the difference? This is a good judge for your current dynamic range. Depending on the audio I'm working with, for most mainstream music such as pop or rock, I find that a dynamic range of 6 dB gives me the desired tightness without the overcompressed feeling. To get the desired dynamic range, I calculate the current dynamic range and subtract my desired range to get a number of how much the compressor needs to reduce the audio by. So if the audio has a dynamic range of 12 dB and I want it to be 6 dB, then I need to have the compressor reduce the level by 6 dB. Now that I know how much to reduce, I need to set up the compressor to do so. As I described earlier, the reduction amount is a result from a calculation between the threshold value and the ratio. So in theory, I could enter a threshold of -12 and a ratio of 2 to 1, and that would give me a 6 dB reduction. However, this would not always be the case. You need to set your threshold to a level that would actually make a difference. If set too high, then you would be reducing only the peaks and not much of the dynamic range. If set too low, then you would be just reducing the overall volume, not necessarily reducing the dynamic range. So in my example here, I'm going to set the threshold to around the lower values of my RMS meter and set the ratio so that it works out to be a 6 dB reduction. At this time, I'd like to point out that you will need to apply your math skills here to work out the ratio based on your threshold and desired reduction amount. For many, myself included, do not want to bother with the calculation process. In that case, I would recommend a compressor plugin that shows you the resulting curve. This allows you to adjust the ratio until the graph shows the desired amount of reduction. Several compressors will come with a gain reduction meter in addition to an output meter. This allows you to quickly see how much reduction is actually being achieved. If you are trying to reduce the audio by 6 dB, then watch the gain reduction as you adjust the ratio until you see a 6 dB reduction. If you are doing this, be sure to pass through various sections of your audio source to ensure that you're not reducing the quieter passages by 6 dB. This would result in a much larger reduction to the louder passages. Slower gain reduction meters may be more suited for this job. Another thing to consider when choosing your compressor. Once you have your desired reduction and dynamic range, you may want to adjust the attack and release settings to smooth out the effects of the compressor. The attack setting will control how fast the compressor begins to reduce the audio once passing the threshold. If this setting is set too slow, the compressor won't have any real effect. Setting it too fast will lead to distortion. As a general rule, I use a setting that will allow just the transients of the audio source to pass through the compressor unaffected. Again, this will depend on the audio you are working with. The release setting controls how fast the compressor will return to normal level after the audio has fallen below the threshold. I often use a slower release time so that the audio isn't falling back so fast that it creates a pumping sound. It is easy enough just to start with a release time of about 50 milliseconds and slowly increasing the release time till you hear no more pumping from the compressor. A tip here is if your compressor has a gain reduction meter, is to watch this meter while adjusting the release. Here you can see just how fast the compressor is being released. Here I'm going to show you how I often will set my attack and release times. Again, I stress that this is not a golden rule, and that all master engineers out there will do the same. However, I do find this a great starting point and an excellent way to learn about the relationship between the attack and release settings. For this, you'll need a compressor that has a gain reduction meter. Before I have made any adjustments to my ratio setting, I'll be sure that my attack and release settings are as low as they can go. I then adjust my ratio till I have the desired gain reduction. Next, I will increase my release time till the compressor smooths out the audio level a bit. The reduction amount actually increases. This is because the audio is not being released back to its original level fast enough before the compressor applies even more reduction. This gives you a great demonstration of the relationship between the release setting to the compressor. Now, I don't want that extra gain reduction that was introduced by the increased release time. To counteract this, I will adjust my attack time. Increasing the attack time will lower the reduction amount. I will set my attack time so the reduction is the same as before I altered the release time. This is a result of the compressor being slower to respond. Therefore, the release has a better chance to returning the audio to the original level before more reduction is applied. On a side note, as you can imagine, there are many software compressors out there. Some might have no attack or release settings at all. These compressors will analyze the audio and determine automatically the best attack and release times. These are great if you do not want to mess around with tweaking. However, I should warn that some of these plugins may do a better job than others. Something you should check if you plan on buying such a compressor. Some compressors offer a makeup gain. As you are essentially reducing the loudness, the makeup gain will allow you to compensate for this reduction. Good for if you're applying a large amount of reduction. Otherwise, you will most likely not need to make any adjustments to a makeup gain. A lot of plug-in compressors offer multi-band compression, which has a great advantage when it comes to gaining more control over your compression. How this works is that your compressor will split the audio into 2 or more frequency bands and allow you to compress each band individually. This is an excellent benefit, as often you'll find that the audio source may have the desired dynamics in one frequency while needing some reduction in another, which can help avoid any unnecessary compression. When working with multi-band compressors, I approach each band in the same fashion as I did earlier with a single band compressor. I should point out though that there is a risk of altering the overall frequency curve that you have created with your EQ. This is due to the fact that you might end up reducing one frequency band by a large amount. But the advantage here is that there is much less of a chance that you'll hear the compressor working, which is often described as a pumping sound. Often I'll find my frequency curve to be spot on and will use only a one band compressor over the entire range. So now that you have the dynamic range under control, your next step would be to maximize the loudness of your song, which we'll take a look at in the next chapter. By now you should have the frequency curve balanced perfectly, and you have your dynamic range under control. It is time to maximize the loudness of your song. This is typically the final stage of your mastering chain. There are several plugins on the market that can take care of this task quite effectively, some of course better than others. However, no matter which product you choose, they all have the same method as to how they work. They are brick wall limiters with a gain control that allow you to increase the overall volume without going over a predetermined threshold. Again, as we touched on in the last chapter, these tools can make it easy to fall victim to the loudness war. Back in the days of analog recordings, tape and LPs had a lower tolerance to hot RMS levels. If the levels got too hot, there would be saturation and distortion. Therefore, the levels had to be kept within a certain range. However, with the digital medium, the tolerance to hotter and louder recordings has increased. As long as you keep the peaks under 0 dB in the digital world, there is no saturation or distortion to worry about. In fact, it is perfectly normal to go over 0 or to clip the odd peak here and there, and the ear would not notice. And with these tools, it is possible to increase the loudness to these hot levels while keeping the peaks under 0 dB. There are actually two methods that are commonly used when maximizing the loudness: limiting and clipping. Some of the plugins will do only one of the two. Some can do both, such as Isotopes Ozone. We'll first have a look at limiting. Limiting works much the same as the compression we looked at in the last chapter. The main difference is the ratio in the attack settings. A limiter will typically have a fixed and very fast attack setting as well as a high ratio. The job is not to allow any peaks to go beyond the threshold setting. Here I have demonstrated what such a limiter would look like. Often these limiters will have a release setting which allows you to smooth out compression of the limiter. As a general rule here, the more limiting that is applied, the longer the release setting should be so that the audio does not have any pumping. Another tool that can be used to maximize the loudness is a clipper. A clipper works by basically clipping the peaks at a predetermined threshold as opposed to compressing them. The advantage of a clipper over a limiter is that you are not actually compressing the audio, so there's no need to worry about release times or any other artifacts introduced by compression. There are two types of clippers, soft clipping and hard clipping. Soft clippers work by gradually reducing the volume as the peaks begin to reach the threshold. This allows the clip to have a softer sound and can resemble the natural saturation that can be found with analog devices and tape recordings. Here I am demonstrating how the clipper works with GVST's G-Clip. This is an excellent freeware clipper that has both hard and adjustable soft clipping. Which method you choose will largely depend on your personal taste and the style of music you are working with, or even at the request of a client. In terms of loudness, if you are thinking as loud as possible, forget it. In fact, too loud will cause ear fatigue and will create the listener to actually lose interest in listening to your music. So how loud should it be? This has been under debate, but a few respected mastering engineers in the industry have proposed a set of standardizations for the loudness of music material. For example, Bob Katz has put forward to the industry his idea on loudness standards, known as the K-meter system. This particular system, personally, I find to be a great proposal and a great guide when maximizing the audio levels. In this demonstration, I'm going to show a few different plugins to maximize the levels. The first one I'm using here is once again Isotopes Ozone. I have set the maximizer to be a clipper as opposed to a limiter. The Ozone maximizer also comes with a histograph that shows you the RMS levels of your audio over the last few seconds. This helps you get a good idea of how much gain you need to apply. If supported by your RMS meter, try to set the response speed to a slower value. This will be easier to see how much gain is required than if your meter was responding faster. Blue Cat Audio Digital Peak Meter is great for this. Before you start applying any gain, make sure your threshold is set to just under 0 dB. I'll typically set my threshold to minus 0.01 dB. Using the RMS level as your guide, apply gain to your RMS levels are averaging around minus 12 dB on the louder portions of your audio source. This should give you all the loudness you need. Another thing that would be a good idea to check into when choosing your RMS meter or even your limiter clipper is to see if there's support for the K-meter system. As the system is being widely accepted, there are a few plugins now that will allow you to adjust the output meter to follow these standards. For example, with Voxino's Span, you can select the meter type to match one of the K-metering standards. When the song is played through, this meter will show you a plus or minus value. If it is minus, then you have more room to increase your loudness. If it is positive, then it's too loud. In other words, try to get it to 0 dB to meet the K-meter standards. Again, depending on the loudness maximizer you are working with, you may have some additional features that are available to you. For example, some might have dithering built in. If you are working with 24 or 32-bit files and you are mastering for CD, then you'll need to dither down to 16-bit. There may be other options, such as Ozone that has a DC filter to ensure that there are no DC offset errors in the final output. So by this point, we have taken a look at the 3 most common steps when mastering. However, there are other tools that are often used to add shine or body. In the next few chapters, I will be sharing some tips that will help you perfect your mastering. In this chapter, we're going to talk about optimizing the stereo image of your mix. You may be surprised to know that there is the ideal width to your stereo image. When mixing or mastering in stereo, you may not notice any problems whatsoever. Everything is sitting in its proper place. However, in some cases, even with commercial releases, if you are to play that stereo track through a mono playback device, you may find that some of the parts of your mix have disappeared altogether. This is a result of the left and right channel being out of phase with each other. And what that means is the difference between the left and right channels is so great that when merged together into a mono channel, they cancel each other out, resulting in the disappearance of certain tracks. Now, depending on your host, you may have a phase meter at your disposal. This is what you should be using to check that your stereo mix is not out of phase. If you need one, there are a few plugins on the market that can be used within your host that will allow you to monitor and possibly edit the stereo image. In the first chapter, I talked about using a good frequency analyzer when applying EQ. So a good option here would be to have a look at NewGen's Visualizer. Not only does this plugin have an excellent frequency analyzer, but also comes equipped with an excellent phase meter. A phase meter basically has two portions. A plot type graph that will show you how the audio is placed within the stereo field. Use this portion of the meter to get a quick glance at the current stereo width. This meter should be more vertical in body than horizontal. The second portion of the meter will give you a more detailed information on the phase correlation. It is broken up into three values, -1, 0, and +1. Your stereo image should have the value that is hovering between 0 and +1. There may be a few peaks or short sections that float over to the -1 side of 0. This is perfectly acceptable, as long as the majority of your audio is on the +1 side. If you are seeing phase issues, then the simplest way to correct them is to narrow the stereo image. There are a good number of plugins that can do this for you. Of course, all stereo image plugins are slightly different, but all have the same goal, which is to make the stereo image wider or narrower. So while watching your phase meter, adjust the amount of width so that it is no wider than the 0 line. As I mentioned earlier, there may be the odd point where the width might go beyond 0, and this is perfectly acceptable, as long as it is not permanently staying over the 0 point. Anything within 0 and +1 is what you want to see. The desired width is really a personal taste, or that of the client's. A wide image may have space and could make the mix sound larger. However, this can have a negative effect in the details of the mix. So try to find a happy balance between the detail and size. Now with all that said, in the next chapter we're going to take a look at some tips that will tighten up the low end and add punch as well as width to your mix. One thing that is very common and people really want to hear when they are mastering their music, other than loudness, is a tight, punchy low end. And while this can be achieved mostly during the EQ stage with a well-balanced frequency curve, another area that is often overlooked is the stereo image of the low end. In the last chapter, we looked and learned about phase correcting by making sure that our stereo image is not too wide. I also mentioned that in many cases having a wide stereo image can take away detail from your mix. And one area that is usually affected is the low end. Ideally, you want the low end of your mix to be strictly mono, unless of course you are going for some sort of effect. Typically, everything under 300 Hz should be in the dead center of the stereo field. Now you may be thinking that during your mixdown process, you did place all of your bass tracks or kick drums etc. in the center, so there should be no problems. However, we need to consider other areas of your mix, such as reverbs or any other effects that you may be using. For example, if you are using a stereo reverb, then the low end of the reverb will not be mono. There are a few plugins out there that can achieve this for you. Essentially, they filter everything under a predetermined frequency into a mono channel. A perfect plugin that comes to mind is NewGen Audio's Mono Filter, With this plugin, you can enter the frequency in which everything below will be converted to the mono channel. You can also preview the mono channel and the stereo channels independently, so you can hear just what in the low end you are filtering. If you don't have a plugin like this, I would suggest looking into it. The price is very affordable and will tighten up your mix a great deal. If you are using Isotopes Ozone, then there is already a trick that can achieve the same desired results. Isotope comes with a stereo image module. This module is part of the multi-band modules of the plugin. Set one of the available bands to the desired cutoff frequency point, again around 300 Hz is good, and decrease the width for that band all the way till it becomes a mono channel. Ozone also has a phase correlation meter built in, so you can see instantly the effect. You can also solo the one band to hear and see the changes. Ozone is equipped with 6 modules that will allow you to do all your mastering in the one plugin. However, when adjusting the stereo width of your mix using Ozone, it's a good idea to use 2 instances of the plugin. The reason for this is that the stereo image module is tied into the other multi-band modules. So if you want to tighten the low end into your mono channel, yet wanted to apply a single band of compression to the entire frequency range, you would not be able to. Therefore, a good idea is to set and adjust your stereo image before running your audio through another instance of Ozone, or any other plugin. A nifty tip for you here. Personally, when I'm correcting or adjusting my stereo image, I'll run the audio through 2 filters. The first one would be used to widen the image, and the second one would be used to convert the low end to a mono channel. What I'm going to do here is, while watching my phase correlation meter, increase the width so that it reaches close to 0 mark but not over. As the audio next runs through a plugin to tighten the low end, I will never have to worry about losing the detail in my bass range. At the same time, adding space to the mid and higher range frequencies without losing any detail. For Ozone users, this can be achieved by using 2 bands in the stereo images, one band for everything under 300 Hz and the other band for the rest. In this chapter, we'll take a look at what I call an optional step in mastering, applying reverb to your audio. The reason why I call this step optional is that some may feel that adding reverb when mastering a compilation of several tracks will give the listener the same impression of space and environment from one track to the next. However, some find that adding reverb is not required or desired. The choice is up to you and the overall project. I am sure we all have had some experience when working with reverb plugins or external devices. The key role of a reverb is to add dimension to your audio by recreating a listening environment. A good example is listening to a drum mix via close mics. You would hear and feel all of the drums, but none of the room or space that the drums were being played in. Reverb during the mastering stage is often used to add that feel to your audio. Now again, every engineer will have their own taste, but personally I will use a little reverb on the audio if I feel that it is lacking that environmental element. Another use for a reverb is that if you're mastering a range of songs that are to be compiled together, a good idea is to use a specific type or preset reverb that allow you to add the same environmental element to each track. Applying reverb can be viewed as a personal preference or perhaps a request from the artist or recording company. Are there any rules or guidelines when applying it? Well, to avoid argument, I will say no. However, there are some tips that I can think of that you can benefit from. A general guideline that I personally follow is a reverb should be something that one can feel, but not hear. When applying reverb, you should aim so that you have the same sensation as being in a particular environment without hearing the details of the reverb. Therefore, it would be a good idea to know what type of room or environment setting you are trying to achieve before you start applying. As to where you place your reverb in the mastering chain is really open to individual taste, but you will typically want to place it after the EQ and of course before the final peak limiter. Whether you place it before or after your compressor will solely depend on whether or not you want the reverb applied to the compressed audio or uncompressed audio. I tend to place my reverb after the compressor. Presets seem to bring on a love-hate relationship with many artists or recording engineers. Either they love to use presets as it makes life easier, or hate to use them as they want to create a custom sound that they can call their own. Regardless if you're going to be starting with a preset that has been designed by yourself or one that came bundled with your reverb, if you are working with the entire project of multiple songs, I would suggest that you use the same reverb preset for each song in the project. This will ensure that each song has the same environment. If you are going to be applying reverb to your audio, remember that you will be changing the perceived width of the stereo image. And remember that to maintain our tight low end, we should be keeping those lows in the dead center. Two options to control this. The first is to use a reverb that will allow you to control the frequency ranges of the reverb that is actually applied, so that you are applying a reverb to only the mid and higher frequencies. However, the problem with this is that you may not achieve the desired simulated environment without the low end portion of the reverb. So the second option might make more sense, which would be to apply reverb to the audio source before applying any phase correcting or converting the lower end frequencies to a mono channel. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at adding extra bite to your audio by using exciters. An exciter recreates some of the shine that can be often found with analog devices, where some of the harmonics in certain frequencies would be enhanced or boosted. This could often create desirable effects. For example, when trying to add more oomph to your bass end frequencies, instead of applying EQ gain, why not excite the natural harmonics of your bass frequencies to make the bass stand out even more? Yet once again, there are a few choices with exciter plugins. Users of Wavelab will have Spectralizer, a simple to use exciter that allows you to enhance the harmonics of a specified frequency. Most will operate in the same manner. Input a frequency that you would like to enhance and adjust the mix of the harmonic results. For those that are using Isotopes Ozone, you will find an exciter as one of the 6 modules. The exciter in Ozone is actually like 4 exciters, as it is part of the multi-band modules. Each band has an exciter with a control to adjust the amount of simulated tube saturation, which creates the harmonics, and another control the mix of the harmonics to the original audio. When making adjustments to your exciter, have a look at your frequency analyzer. You should be able to see harmonics being introduced into your frequency curve. Adjust the mix level and make sure you are not creating any sudden peaks with the harmonics. Often it's a good idea to keep your eye on the specified frequency from your exciter. Try not to have any sudden gain in that frequency area. This will alter the balance of your frequency curve.